Welcome, everyone. This video was recorded during the workshop on Meeting the Challenges of Transdisciplinary Sustainability Research, facilitated by Esther Turnhout and Josie Chambers and organized by the Belmont Forum CRA Oceans coordination team. This workshop is an official UN Ocean Decade activity.
So let me just share my screen. Let's see here. Okay, and then make this full screen. So hopefully everyone can see this okay. And as Fred mentioned, I'm Josie Chambers. I'm an assistant professor at the Urban Future Studio. And while my background is a little bit varied, I actually started off studying honeybee genomics in biology for my undergrad, and then went into studying wild primates, and then from there started studying more of the social dimensions and issues around nature conservation. And I would say about a decade ago, I was much more focused on the content of the kind of knowledge that I was producing, and over time, really started to question my emphasis as a researcher on just that content, and started to focus a lot more on how I was producing that research, who I was working with, and how the implications of different ways of engaging with society for the kinds of impacts that can actually potentially come from that research. So it's really nice to be here and kind of reflect together on some of the different ideas and lessons that have come out of this. And Esther and I, we worked together closely on these topics for the last 2 years and continuing going forward. So yeah, really nice to be here. For the agenda, as I mentioned, both myself and Esther, we plan to present for about 10 minutes each. Myself on just reflecting on from my recent research, what is transdisciplinary research, which is a big loaded question. And then Esther, more of a political perspective on knowledge and participation. And so we hope that this can seed some of the discussion, but then from there on out, we will be having a much more interactive dialogue involving polls and also a role play to reflect on what is our role as researchers, and we'll use a particular framework that we hope can help you reflect on your own role that you often step into, and discuss and think about how these different roles can sometimes hinder our engagement with society and the kinds of transformations that might result. And then after the break, we'll spend the second half thinking about how can we do research differently. So given some of these challenges, can we discuss these and share some of our ideas and best practices? And we'll do that a bit, probably across 2 breakouts. We'll see kind of how many people we end up with, but then also as a plenary discussion. And yeah, so that's the plan for this afternoon, to dive kind of straight into what is this big question of what is transdisciplinary research. I thought, yeah, perhaps I could share some of my recent research that I've done on this topic. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with all of these different terms that are floating around alongside transdisciplinarity, such as co-management, co-design, co-production, social learning, and all of these different promises about how this different way of doing science by engaging with society might transform the kind of knowledge that we generate, the ways that we shift practices or policies, might restructure our institutions, and also engage with issues of justice and power, and ultimate kind of changes in our social ecological systems. And so going back to 2017, I saw a lot of these terms being thrown around and was especially curious to know more about what are the implications of these many different approaches, this language we're using, the different methods. And I noticed that a lot of different dangers were being flagged up. So this is this article on the left side here, kind of called The Dark Side of Co-Creation and Co-Production, the 7 Evils. Which really flags up that we often think that transdisciplinary work and co-production, that we kind of put a golden aura around this and assume that this is going to always produce better results, but that it's really important to consider how we might even damage relations or damage trust or reinforce particular power relations if we don't carefully consider the way that we go about this. And then on the flip side, on the right, this is a great article as well about kind of the dark side of how we think about transformation, and again, related to power relations. And so kind of what some of the work I've been involved in is connecting these different approaches in co-production and co-creation and transdisciplinary work to what does that mean for actual transformation. I think we have someone's volume on that we're hearing. So if everyone can
we're
make
trying
sure that you're muted, that would be great. Thanks. And so just to very quickly share a bit with you about what I'm going to present some findings of one recent paper, and it was based on this analysis of 32 different cases of this combination of doing research and producing knowledge and collective action. So these cases all spanned more than 4 different disciplines, but also more than 3 different sectors. And they were also, for some reason, they were very heavily led by women, and we weren't quite sure to what extent that reflects our sampling strategy, and also what extent that reflects just who's working in this space in different areas. But as you can see here, the cases, they span from kind of local co-management, co-produced research, and collective action, also learning networks across different groups, and also even international dialogues and platforms. So all sorts of different formats for bringing together multiple kinds of stakeholders to question how we're addressing different sustainability challenges and the role of producing research and knowledge, but in ways that are fundamentally connected to action and change. And so I'm just going to briefly present kind of a bit of one of the papers. There were 2 papers that came out of this work. But what we found is there are so many different approaches and ways that these projects and cases differed. And just to give you one example, we found that some initiatives were much more focused on, so on the left-hand side, on really kind of questioning how we frame or understand things, and facilitating learning to really challenge the way that we understand the world. And others kind of pinned down, this is what the problem is, and this is how we understand the world, and we want to involve people to solve it. So it was much more kind of solution oriented versus reflective and learning oriented in its purpose. And while you kind of would say, obviously, both of these are really important to transdisciplinary research, and we found that cases that managed to kind of iteratively do both of these were I guess, very interesting in the methods they used, and show the value of doing that, as opposed to getting more stuck into a solution space without that kind of reframing and reflexivity, or vice versa. And then some of the other dimensions that came out, this is, you're probably familiar with this iceberg metaphor, and this indeed links to kind of our understanding of power. Are we focused on more surface level things around kind of the direct individual behaviors that we might see linked to environmental issues, or are we looking at more systemic and structural issues that might be a little bit more distant from the problem that we see at hand, but extremely important also for why things why environmental challenges are so difficult to address. And then across all of these different cases, we saw some that engaged power, more kind of powerful systems or powerful actors, and then tried to influence that kind of reshape their goals or directions to create more space for others. And there were other initiatives that were much more bottom-up focused. They might focus on kind of local community groups and then see how to mobilize power upwards, with really important implications for how they go about transdisciplinary research. And then finally, there were very big differences on the emphasis of the production of knowledge itself versus trying to reshape relationships and institutions, which was much more about actually doing the work of change, as opposed to just producing the knowledge that states what should change. And as I mentioned, we found that these were very much kind of sometimes were pushed into false dichotomies, but it was really important for initiatives to try to engage across these differences or just recognize kind of their positionality of where they are. And so this led to, we did a cluster analysis to see how all these 32 initiatives varied on all these different dimensions I've just described. And we came out with kind of 6 different modes of, in this case, we engage with the term co-production of knowledge and action, as opposed to transdisciplinarity, but two fundamentally linked concepts. And so I hope that by engaging with this paper, and I'll post the link in the chat, it kind of gives you almost like different lenses with which to consider some of the implications of the methods that maybe you apply in your transdisciplinary research, to consider to what extent you're making certain choices, potentially explicitly or implicitly, and what implications that might hold. And just because I don't have time to kind of go into all these 6 modes, and you can look at the paper after, but just to kind of briefly reflect on some differences, we found that some of these different approaches were much more well-suited for particular aims. So ones that were much more focused on reframing and forging new relations and more systemic issues were much more powerful for fundamentally shifting people's perspectives, to really open up more transformative ideas of what people could do together. But then kind of the opposite one on the right side of researching solutions, which was much more focused on kind of direct interpretations of problems, solving solutions, generating knowledge. It was often assumed that that would reframe or change perspectives, but we found it was really only effective when decision makers already wanted to change something and they needed knowledge to kind of help justify that change. It wasn't necessarily effective in fundamentally reshaping their worldviews. So that just gives you one example. And the one in the middle was much more powerful around actually shifting kind of institutional structures and policies and practices. And all of these were also involved in, they entailed certain risks that were really important to consider. So the left reframing agency that I described, the real danger there was creating these kind of learning echo chambers where people learn a lot and they reflect a lot, but only within a particular space. And a lot of the barriers are kind of remain outside of that process. And then it's really difficult to actually translate that reframing into some sort of tangible action or change. And on the opposite side, over researching solutions, there was a really strong risk of kind of further legitimizing existing power relations, because there's not a lot of space to question existing solutions. It's more about kind of bringing people on board and creating knowledge around kind of existing views. So I hope that gives you, I know that's kind of a very brief overview of this paper. It's really just to kind of point you in the direction if you want to know more. And I'll put this link in the chat, but you can look up this paper and engage more with these different modes, and you can even map out projects as well to kind of think about the approach that you're taking. And for the other paper that came out, just to flag up that there were 2, this one will engage more in the role play that will follow. So I'll leave it there and pass over to Esther.
Yeah, so I hope you can all see my screen now.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So following up from what Josie presented, and I think the different ways in which co-production or transdisciplinary initiatives play out, the consequences they have often these consequences aren't expected or anticipated. They all come down to the need to reflect on how we see knowledge and how we see participation. And what I'm going to suggest is that we need to look at these 2 concepts in a more political sense, because if we don't, what we will end up doing is often a paradoxical outcome of good intentions, where transdisciplinary projects will reinforce dominant conceptions of power, dominant conceptions of knowledge, and dominant hierarchies between those who initiate and those who are then invited to participate. So echoing a lot of the existing knowledge about participation, if you don't think about knowledge, if you don't think about power, if you don't think about participation, you will end up actually increasing the problem, or strengthening or further fixing the problem that actually these initiatives were intended to solve. So this is also why we care about this topic, not to kind of crush transdisciplinarity and co-production initiatives, but really trying to improve the outcomes that they produce. Which is sometimes actually an uncomfortable message. So we are also quite aware of that. So looking at the survey that you kindly filled out as part of your participation in this event, it was really interesting to see that that the answers to some extent were mixed. So one of the questions was about the job of science and whether or not it is to uncover the objective truth. We saw quite some mixed answers. There was some disagreement with that. There was some agreement with that. So yes, perhaps this is an important thing that science is perceived to do. But then there were overwhelmingly supportive answers to the other questions. So there was support for the claim that natural science might not be the most important thing that matters to address challenges, and that societal, indigenous, and local knowledge are also important. So what that suggests is a really good starting ground for thinking about transdisciplinarity and thinking through these important questions. Because what I can skip actually is the explanation that there's really no other option than engagement. We seem to all be on board with that need. Science cannot do this on their own. We need other people and we need other knowledge systems. So that's really an excellent starting point. But then the thing that I would want to emphasize nevertheless is that despite how great this starting point is, it is easy to get trapped in still a narrow way of thinking about engagement. And looking back at what Josie was presented, the risk to come into this space of engagement with a narrow conception of what the problem is, going into solutionist mode quickly, and using the participants to actually implement and adopt your solution. This is then the risk that we still need to talk about a bit more and reflect on a bit more, because that would go against some of the intentions of transdisciplinarity. The starting point that I take is to just basically state that research inevitably engages values. So even if it doesn't engage people or doesn't talk to anyone who are not researchers, that doesn't mean that research is objective in a philosophical sense. Research inevitably engages values, if only for the very simple reason that facts cannot speak for themselves. In order to speak meaningfully or to present meaningfully the results of scientific explorations and investigations, we inevitably frame. And when we frame, we engage values, which also means that knowledge as articulated in frames, or knowledge as seen as facts articulated in frames, that constitutes knowledge, does political work. Because these framings not only help us understand what the problem is, but also restrict and shape what solutions are possible and feasible. And this role of framing also leads immediately to a reflection on which frames are actually powerful and which frames might not be used to present research findings. So inequities within knowledge systems, but definitely also inequities between knowledge systems, lead to certain frames gaining dominance over others. And the reflection on the implications of that, and reflection on how transdisciplinarity approaches might help us mitigate some of these implications is really a crucial task. To give one very quick example, here is somebody who I really admire, Professor Steinberger, reflecting on the knowledge production in the IPCC, saying how under the sort of veil or impression or instruction to be neutral, what science actually ends up doing is supporting and strengthening dominant frames. So if there's anything that you take away from this, is that the attempt to be neutral means that you accept dominant frames and that you reinforce those dominant frames. That is what neutrality comes to mean in practice, which hopefully immediately leads to the invitation to no longer do that, to resist that tendency, and to say that neutrality should actually mean opening up to diverse frames. Neutrality should mean elevating, actively looking for and elevating marginalized frames. So in response to this widely recognized need to engage, we've seen all these transdisciplinarity, co-production, co-shaping, co-design approaches. Josie has presented those a little bit, but because often they don't, in our modest opinion, don't do a very good job, not in all cases at least, to think about power, to think about knowledge, and to think about participation. What they end up doing often is to reinforce existing power relations, existing marginalizations, and framing and locking participants into a narrow solution and problem frame. This actually has a long history. So looking at the history of participation and studies of participation, you see exactly these same patterns repeated in much of what is going on under transdisciplinarity and co-production frames at the moment. The privileging of elites, the privileging of existing power inequalities. So there are these challenges of transdisciplinarity. In practice, what we see, because there is insufficient reflection on power, knowledge, and participation, what you see is continued dominance of natural science, expert knowledge. The creation of equal power relations often does not succeed. There's a drive to consensus, which leads to exclusion and also justifies exclusion. Often also, it's a little bit of a different problem, perhaps, that transdisciplinary approaches tend to be locally based, which means that if you don't engage wider structural forces and power relations, you might have a very interesting and pleasant project where people have changed their minds about specific things, which is really important. But the risk is that that impact stays within the project boundaries and the people that were directly participating, which then also means that the contribution to wider changes is restricted. And so what these projects in the end up doing is again reinforce the status quo, so reproduce the status quo. So what I would suggest is, in order to do this reflection on power, on knowledge, and on participation, we ask ourselves two basic questions. How is the problem defined by whom and what's been excluded? And two, what and whose values are at stake? How are they represented? And again, what is excluded? And I'll skip over, I think, a little bit towards the end, actually. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now and go back to Josie.
Yeah, great, thanks. And thanks for the final people who I see have just also kind of just recently joined.